Hello again, everyone. Tom Nagorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio. Good to have you with us for a conversation today about the U.S. annual threat assessment presented every year around this time by the intelligence community. First crack at this, obviously, from the second Trump administration. And we're here to talk about some of the highlights and also that signal leak controversy that is hanging over this and hung over the hearings this week about it. Beth Sander, great to have you with us, Cipher Brief expert, former Deputy Director for National Intelligence at the ODNI, also served as a daily briefer to the President, knows a lot about what goes into the presentations publicly and privately of this annual report. Great to have you with us, and happy to hear any of your takes on this. We were struck a little bit by what was kind of the leadoff item, both in the written report and in Tulsi Gabbard, the new ODNI's testimony, that put foreign illicit drug actors, as they term them, as the main threat facing the country. It's obviously not a new issue, but to folks who pay attention to this, and I know you do, that issue of narco trafficking kind of just seemed to vault all the way past a lot of other China, Russia, and other related threats. Surprise you at all? And maybe you can talk a little bit about how the community determines what gets that top billing.
Yeah, well, I do think that the emphasis of every annual threat assessment, we call ATA, it changes with every administration. And, this is one of the really interesting things I think about the intelligence community is that, you are driven by the priorities of each administration. And we have a whole process for that. The NIPF process, the National Intelligence Priority Framework, which the White House determines what are the top priorities for the intelligence community to collect on and to focus on and what they do. And so, that's a legitimate process that's been around for decades. And you see it reflected here that this administration is absolutely about America first. And so I really commend the National Intelligence Council and everyone in the intelligence community that put out this document, because I think it retains the integrity of the analytic process on these key issues of great power competition and those key things. But what this document tells you is that everything, including the nation state section, has this emphasis on how does this affect America and Americans and American interests. And I think one of the things that's subtly not very prominent there is how it affects our allies. There are notations on that. There are little phrases here and there, but it really is about America and Americans. And I think that in some ways, you can debate this. I'm not trying to be an apologist or whatever. I'm just an analyst. But I think that this idea that the ATA is to communicate with Americans. It's the only time during the year where the intelligence community actually is putting out a comprehensive document. So I'm asking all of us to reflect, is it wrong that they put something up top that is the fentanyl deaths of, now, tens and tens of thousands. It was 100,000. I mean, it's down.
Right.
Americans, suffering from fentanyl. That, is a thing, and the border. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Right.
But
No, I just a question, and certainly I or we don't mean to suggest anything wrong, but just to understand it. So it's less of a suggestion, and you've just put your finger on the fentanyl and the fact that the deaths are coming down. So the placement of and the prioritization of issue 1 versus issue 2, threat A or threat B, is not necessarily saying this, it's not a reflection that the threat has risen. It's more, as you say, a reflection of the priority the administration places on that threat. Is that right?
I think it's the prioritization, and I think we're going to see this throughout all the national security strategies that are coming out. And as Marco Rubio said, foreign policy now is about the safety, prosperity, and protection of Americans. I've gotten that a little bit wrong, but it's all about Americans. And you're seeing this for I wouldn't say that for the first time, but you're seeing really the framework of this reflect that. And then the tone and content of it, even on the nation state things, are focused very much on America and Americans. And so, yeah, it's the prioritization of that. And then the second thing is, what do we want to communicate to the American people? And so that also reflects that they've decided that what the American people care about or what they want to say, and you heard this in Gabbard talking about America's intelligence community. This is for Americans. And so I think connecting to them is not that different than Jake Sullivan's foreign policy for the middle class of America, but it's just executed in a way that's very different. I would be upset if there were not robust nation state sections here that had the full spectrum of threats that they pose. That would upset me, but I feel like that was there. The thing I didn't like about those was I would have liked to see a little bit more on, and it wasn't absent, but there were sections where I felt like the effect on alliances was downplayed.
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
So I want to ask you about one of those nation state sections, because this was interesting in the way it was presented, I thought, was the Russia portion. There was a lot of speculation, of course, but because all you can do beforehand is speculate. The New York Times ran a big piece, just to pick one, on the juggle that the intelligence community would have, because on the one hand, there are quite clearly, I think most people would agree, a whole range of threats emanating from Russia. On the other hand, the policy of the administration at the moment, as it pursues a peace in Ukraine, appears to be really say very little bad about Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin. And so I was struck by a couple of things and would love to get your thoughts. Tulsi Gabbard said a few things, not that strident, I didn't think, from the public platform yesterday. The document, however, is an almost prosecutorial litany of the threats and dangers that the IC perceives from Russia. So certainly not holding anything back there, I guess. I'll stop there. Any thoughts?
Completely. I think it mirrors the China section in terms of going through the litany. There is a malign influence section for all four key adversaries, right? So there was one for China, there was one for Russia, there was one for Iran, right? I think there was one for North Korea as well. And so I think that just having, this is how the intelligence community kind of manages being able to continue to say the things that are important to say, is by having process and structure that supports the continuity of analysis. And I think we saw that continuity of analysis, but what we saw was mentions of Greenland, for example, in both the China and the Russia sections that we never would have seen in the Biden administration, right? Now, I didn't see anything on the Panama Canal. There wasn't a Latin America section, which I think, you know, while it was incorporated into the first section on transnational cartels and criminal organizations, there was a lot on Mexico in there, but there really wasn't this shift to the Western Hemisphere as being a core U.S. interest. And treating that to me was one of the big absences, that it was almost like we're putting America first with this whole section in the front, and then we're doing great power, but then it's like we're not actually reflecting this change. Like, where was Venezuela? I don't think I remember Venezuela in there.
And
so those were interesting to me, but I think on Russia, I mean, I think that the analysts there did a great job on Russia is an enduring threat across all of these areas. That was clear, and Tulsi Gabbard was asked about it in the Senate hearing yesterday, and she answered it, I felt, very clearly and well. She also answered a question about Russia's malign influence and sabotage efforts in Europe, which is not really prominent in the piece because, again, this is about America. So I felt like that was missing from the ATA, but she answered the question quite correctly, in my view, and clearly, with no hesitations. So that should be, people should feel good about that.
Yeah, but back just to understand as a layperson, which I certainly am when it comes to this and many things, your point earlier on the narco trafficking point of just being in line with the administration. I mean, I'll just read you a quote from the written report. Russia will continue to be able to deploy anti-U.S. diplomacy, coercive energy tactics, disinformation, espionage, influence operations, military intimidation, cyber attacks, and gray zone tools to try to compete below the level of armed conflict and fashion opportunities to advance Russian interests. There's a lot of stuff like that. That's not at all in line with the public posture of Mr. Trump himself, Steve Witkoff, and so forth.
And it wasn't in Tulsi's opening comments.
Right.
But she did have the enduring threat issue in there, just the fact of. So, this is always a balance on ATA. We can look back at how Director Coates really got crossways with the administration on the malign influence issue itself. And, had really made President Trump very angry in the first administration. And of course, at that point, he was much more sensitive about his legitimacy, even though that's not what the piece said. And as this one makes very clear, it's not about effects on elections. That is not the number one worry here. So it is clearly not saying this isn't, affecting necessarily voters. And that's never in the writ of the intelligence community to talk about. But the danger in this document in many places is that, there are things in here that are different than U.S. policy objectives and that would complicate U.S. policy objectives. And in this case, appear quite different in how they would be presented. Compared to how, if you ask President Trump to talk about that, he wouldn't say that. So, I think maybe year 2 document may be more instructive in terms of where we are. But look, this process of creating the ATA, it literally is a 6-month process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they start working on this and they make adjustments. And it started, I'm sure, before the election. And then they have to shift priorities around. But I always think of ATA as primarily on the unclassified. This is going to sound terrible to people. I don't mean to say that it shouldn't be informative, but it always will fall short of people's expectations, because the number one directive in this is, we don't really want to create headlines here. We want to create a base case of what's going on, have integrity there, have clarity, but it's not going to lean into the areas where there's a lot of classified information. And so it can tend to be on the pablum side easily. But even with that, when you're making just clear statements, you can run into conflicts with, what the policymakers would prefer you to say. One last point here. Tulsi Gabbard said, did this document go through the White House for approval? And she said, I think that they got it the same day you did. Well, if that's the case, then the process of this document was different than every other year that I know of. The document always goes to the National Security Council for them to have a look and an opportunity to comment prior to publication. Now, that doesn't mean that the intelligence community will change what is said, and there might be a debate, but they definitely know beforehand, and they push back on things where they think analytically they disagree. And it's up to the intelligence community to say, is this important enough for us to fight back? And this happens in every administration. I remember having an argument with someone in, I think, the Obama administration over something kind of small, but very important to this particular NSC director. And we just decided, no, we're not doing that.
So, Beth Sander, in the time we have left, you mentioned headline. They don't want to make headlines at this thing. Speaking of which,
It was
and nothing
all
to
about the other
do.
headline.
Right. So just a couple. We don't have to relitigate the whole thing with the signal leak and what happened. But I did, speaking of layperson's questions, the CIA director and Tulsi Gabbard, the ODNI leader, both said that nothing was classified in those exchanges. Help us to understand. Should we? Is that a technicality that who could have classified or what? But how did you read that statement? First of all.
I read it like I was watching the impeachment hearing of President Clinton trying to define what sex was. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little in the down and dirty here with you, Tom, but it is like really parsing these words. I'm not talking about DOD classified, I'm talking about CIA classified. Like, really? I felt
Mm-hmm.
like some of the senators brought it to brass tacks. This isn't the end of the story here, but there are clear questions here, and whether there was technically CIA or ODNI classified on this call is not a core question. It's just
Right.
not. That's not the point.
And just
That's not the concern.
and just to understand, so in other words, in your view, it either should have been classified or whatever the case was not something that should have been widely shared, right? I mean, it sounds silly
Yeah.
to even say
Okay.
that. But yeah.
Right. The idea that talking about a strike on a foreign country before that strike happens is classified. It just is. It was secret. It was something that they would not want publicly released. And as Senator Mark Kelly pointed out, signal's not supposed to be used for even sensitive but unclassified information. This idea of what CUI stand for, I always forget.
I wrote it down
It's
somewhere.
like sensitive, unclassified information. I'm so sorry, I forget the stupid acronyms.
Okay.
But this idea that, you shouldn't have anything, you shouldn't be talking about anything that you don't want public on the Signal chat. That is a regulation. Anytime you have discussions about a strike, I don't care whether there's a target or not a target, but if you do, and I know there from the press that there probably was, there's just no way that this wasn't sensitive enough that they shouldn't have been doing it there. But let's talk about the other things really quick here that matter. One is that this shows that they don't have a policy process. You should not be having a disagreement about the timing of a strike after the president has signed off on it. Where is your policy process? Secondly, why are you having a policy process via text? That is not a policy process with emojis and other things, right? This is not how serious government conversations, this is not how you work out whether you should be going to war with another non-state actor, country, whatever. And I worry this isn't one off. So there's just a whole process issue here. The second thing is that Signal might be pretty secure. It is. But the implement that you are using may or may not be. And the fact that Witkoff was in Moscow, and there's an ability for very, very serious nation state actors like Russia, and warnings have gone out about them trying to penetrate Signal, but also they have been trying to break into phones, right? We know that China got into administration phones prior to the election, President Trump, right? So how do we know that the mobile device itself, which can then look at your keystrokes, I know what you're typing, in a maybe in a hostile environment where lots of things can then be put on your phone. Look at NSO from Israel and sons of NSO. It's just like, that's a disaster. And then the third thing is the record keeping. And Director Radcliffe said, my staff followed the rules on record keeping. And I would not be at all surprised if that is, I don't think he would say that, honestly, if that wasn't true. I think that CIA people probably did that. But did Hegseth's people? Did Waltz? Because the people who are supposed to be recording a small group PC is the White House, not Radcliffe. I mean, he has to keep track of his communications, but like, this is a formal policy meeting.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be put in the record, including all of the disputes and the conversations. That is a requirement by law, and there is a reason. And the final thing is like just this pattern of not understanding or caring about rules, including classification. You know, from Doge plugging in a unclassified computer or whatever it was, network into a classified system, to sending down 2 years worth of CIA new hires, names, even though it's only first name, last initial. Please tell me in the world of AI that the AI Doge people don't understand how you could use that to figure out who these people are. So I just feel like, you know, there's this overarching thing here that is showing a lack of understanding and seriousness about the reason we have these rules and processes and laws that appear to have been broken here, and they need to fix that. I'm less about like pointing fingers, accountability, like firing people, you know, whatever. I want to make sure that U.S. processes, systems, and policy making and the protection of intelligence is working. And they need to use this instead of as a cover up for who made mistakes and added somebody, you know, the journalist's name. They need to say, we are going to not do this anymore. And we are going to do it this way because all of these things matter. So I'm like, clearly exercise, Tom. You could not make me stop talking.
Well, and just to be clear, so in your view, the focus on who and how Jeffrey Goldberg was allowed in is less of an issue, more just the whole process was flawed in your view.
Yes, because you shouldn't have been having that conversation. If you're having a conversation on Signal, it should be about logistics, right? Which it started that way, perhaps, right? Look on the high side. So in fact, if it was really everything on that should not be something that you would be afraid to have a journalist on.
Got it. All right, we're going to need to leave it there. Beth Sanner, thanks as always. It's great to have your insights, your insiders' insights on all of this stuff, and look forward to talking again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.